Cast your mind back to Xbox One's launch in 2013 and a few big games stand out. Killer Instinct was one of them. As Microsoft's flagship fighting game, it offered a long overdue revival of Rare's classic franchise, now enhanced through modern day technology. Every impact forced an explosion of alpha effects and lit particles, an obvious upgrade on Xbox One over what was ever possible on Xbox 360, and it all ran at 60 frames per second. It was a sample of what the machine could bring to the table graphically this generation, but there was a downside. Killer Instinct at launch ran at just 720p on Xbox One. Of course the game was later patched to run at 900p, but even early on it was an indication of a limit to the original Xbox One's handling of higher resolutions, a point reinforced by other 720p games at launch, like Battlefield 4. For those wanting to see Killer Instinct at the best image quality possible then, you had to wait for PC, unlocking resolutions up to 4K. That is, until the Xbox One X patch, which lands with the hardware's launch on November 7th. And this is a big deal. Killer Instinct will be the first console fighter to ever run at a native 4K. With that, Microsoft can well and truly put any criticism of image quality in its games to rest. What you see here is preview footage of the game running on actual Xbox One X hardware, and compared to the 900p image on a standard Xbox One, the vault in image quality is huge. Fixed at 3840 by 2160 all the way through, it sets a precedent on console, especially next to fighting games on PS4 Pro. Injustice 2, that runs at 1440p on PS4 Pro. King of Fighters 14, again 1440p on Pro. And then there's Tekken 7 with its 1080p output. It's nowhere near the pixel count Xbox One X is hitting here, but it does help that Killer Instinct is an Xbox One launch title. It may be abundant in particle effects, but games like Injustice 2 still push the boat out further in model detail, animation, and the approach to its materials and lighting. For Killer Instinct, it's impressive for one main reason then. Jumping from 900p to 4K involves a 5.76 times increase in pixel count for Xbox One over the older machine. That's 5.76 times the GPU load, and Killer Instinct achieves it despite only having a 4.6 times boost in GPU power to work with. The result is inevitably a much cleaner, crisper image, but while it's worth celebrating, there are some things the Xbox One X patch doesn't do. Are textures upgraded at all? And what about the game's effects or even shadows? Well, sadly, everything is otherwise exactly as it appeared before, with the exception of texture filtering, which scales in quality with the 4K boost. As you can see in these comparisons, you're getting the same settings as a regular Xbox One machine, and really it might have been nice to have high grade textures, for example, but even at 4K these assets hold up pretty well. None of this should come as a surprise though. Resolution was the only upgrade path for Killer Instinct on PC, where max settings are equivalent to a standard Xbox One. Here we now have PC at max settings and running at 4K versus Xbox One X's playback, and you can see it's more or less like for like. All settings are the same. Ambient occlusion, bloom, motion blur, anti-aliasing and reflections are all enabled, with shadow and texture quality on the high preset. The one snag I found is that the HUD and text remain at 1080p on both sides, and it detracts a little bit from the presentation. The fact is though, a basic i3 processor with an R7 370 back in the day could run the game at these high presets and 1080p 60fps. Even then, clearly this was a well optimized game, and with Xbox One X's horsepower thrown at it, you can see why 4K works so well. Take the frame rate as an example of this. Xbox One X's performance at 4K is absolutely bang on 60fps 99% of the time, with VSync engaged as well. Now inevitably there are drops when those heavy alpha effects kick in for special moves, and that begins to tussle for the same memory bandwidth as resolution. As an average though, 60fps is largely what you're looking at, but to cherry pick some worst case moments during these moves, you do get drops to 55fps, like this move with Sadira, and at the very lowest on record, 50fps. There is of course scope for improvement by release. The drops here aren't egregious enough to break the game, especially given they kick in during special moves where you have no input anyway. The turnout is positive then, and on PC, 4K was always in the running for GPUs with a similar power profile to Xbox One X. Take AMD's RX 580 as a case in point. The card capably handles Killer Instinct's top settings at 4K and 60fps, and even rides out those special moves with no drops. It's essentially a 6 teraflop GPU, and though lower on bandwidth next to Xbox One X, it still hits the mark. Overall then, the only downside is there's no other upgrades on Xbox One X. It's a straightforward patch tying into the original promise of the console with that 4K resolution and texture filtering boost. but it does give us a great reason to revisit the game years after it first hit store shelves. With the Season 3 expansion, Killer Instinct's character roster is now overflowing with options, where originally the game lacked diversity. Is it the best looking fighter on console then? Certainly by the numbers, it hands in the cleanest image quality possible for an Ultra HD set. As it stands right now, it's unmatched. And given the wide use of 1440p for fighters on PS4 Pro, it'll be fascinating to see what multi-platform fighters like Injustice 2 run at on Microsoft's machine. For now though, Killer Instinct is a great demo for the Xbox One X's launch, just as the game was for the original Xbox One. As a fighter, there may be more cinematic, technically advanced games on the market, but if you're looking to scratch that 4K itch, this is a brilliant way to go when the time comes. Anyway, that's all from me. If you enjoy our Xbox One X coverage and want to stay up to date with the latest comparisons once the console launches, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. And being a 4K video, it's really worth checking out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for the original source file. But until next time, thanks for watching.